so don't worry about trying to copy down everything. So at the end of it, we'll come back on to this and we can have a more discussion about some of the information I'm going to share. But what I want to do is just talk about what that letter, where it came from, and what some of the difficulties are in it, and how it does or does not respond to our moment. Because some of us might be asking, well, why are we talking about racism when we're dealing with a pandemic? And one of the things I want to point out is that we can't understand this pandemic unless we understand that there are some real racial disparities that are present in this moment that we're in right now. So COVID or no COVID, we still have to deal with this issue of racism and our church's inadequate response, I would say, and that's a nice word for what we have to deal with. So let's see if this will work. If I've been, the host is disabled participant screen sharing. So if you could, whoever is the host, if you could enable me to share my screen, that would be great. I'm not sure who the host is.
I think it's me.
It's you, okay.
Share screen.
Do you know how to do this, Father Aiden?
Multiple participants.
At the bottom.
Yeah.
Is that it?
Yep. Okay. Great. Now you've done well, Aiden. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, Father.
All right. Okay. Who has to show respect now? Okay. We're gonna be. Our people are gonna see us at our worst, Aiden.
Okay.
So we'll see if we can do it here. Okay.
Make it happen.
I'm making it happen here. Okay. So what I want to do is first talk about open wide our hearts. And what I want to do is talk about the immediate context of the document being what happened in Ferguson and Charlottesville. Look at some of the signs of the times that's going on now in the church in terms of white nationalism and the COVID virus. Then the drafting process of the document and some of its themes, open wide our hearts, what's missing and why is it missing, and where do we go from here? So first, the immediate context of the document came about because of the prior lackluster responses on the part of our church. Especially when we look at the church's response to the Black Lives Matter movement protests that took place in the aftermath of the death of Michael Brown and the killing of African Americans, predominantly African American young people around our country. The bishops then gathered in 2015 in St. Louis, which is the archdiocese in which Ferguson is situated, and they weren't going to say anything about the Black Lives Matter movement or about these protests. The Black bishops said you can't gather in St. Louis and not say anything because they had to drive past Ferguson from the airport to get to the hotel where they were meeting. And so at the very last moment, the president of the conference, Bishop Kurz, gave a statement in which he told the bishops and the Catholic priests, Catholic people, what they should do in response to Black Lives Matter. They should pray for peace and healing. They should study the Word of God to better appreciate human dignity. They should make a sincere effort to encourage people to get to know people of different races. They should make Catholic parishes more welcoming of families of different races. And then finally, and we're to get to know law enforcement officers and to encourage young people to respect all legitimate authority. And that's what Catholics were supposed to do in response to this issue. Needless to say, that was not a very adequate response because it didn't deal with the fact that Catholics, that people that African Americans were respectful police officers, and there were widespread police misconduct taking place around the whole country. And so, as we all know, African American parents for many, many years have been giving their children the talk of how to behave in the presence of law enforcement. But the bishops made no reference to the widespread police misconduct that gave rise to the Black Lives Matter protests. Similarly, in Charlottesville, when we saw these scenes that we haven't seen across the United States since the darkest days of the civil rights movement, of white nationalists taking over an American city with tiki torches and flames, saying that you will not replace us. In response to this violence, which injured many and killed a protester, The bishops again gave very tepid responses. The local bishop called for people to sit down and to talk about and seek respectful solutions to their differences. And then the national president, Bishop Carlo Donardo, said that he joined their voices in a call for calm. These responses were majorly critiqued, saying, are you just simply asking that we should dis a dialogue with neo-Nazis and come up with compromises and mutually acceptable solutions? Well, that's just ridiculous. And there were people wondering, where was the explicit condemnation of white supremacy? In light of that, then the bishops then kind of had a recalibration and issued a second statement in which they explicitly condemned neo-Nazism and white supremacy. But then again, they also announced this initiative, and among the new initiatives they announced was the formation of an ad hoc committee against racism, ad hoc being a very key term here. They called for a national day of prayer, and they also announced that they were going to draft a new statement against racism. But again, this ad hoc committee, again, ad hoc meaning something that's sporadic, was not given any funding or any additional staff support, unlike previous ad hoc committees, such as the one on religious liberty, which the bishops gave 2 additional staff, a lawyer and a lobbyist, and elevated to full committee status. So what we see is that even in the announcement of this new initiative of this pastoral letter, that the bishops didn't really put a lot of their resources to it. I was interviewed shortly thereafter, and I gave something that was kind of a flippant kind of response, in which I said the bishops want to face racism, that they'll own their own complicity. I'll keep that in mind, because when we get to open wide our hearts, one of the things that's going to be missing is any recognition that the church has anything to repent of when it comes to racism. So that's the background. Now, what's going on that makes racism a pressing issue today? And most of this we already know. I'm going to run through this really quickly, but it's basically talking about the depths of the rise of white nationalism. We look at our current political environment. We have to understand that white nationalism has become a major force in American life. Why? Because it's a reaction to the major demographic changes that are taking place in our country. Already in the last census, we found that almost 1/3 of Americans were, in the words of the Census Bureau, non-white or Latino. We also know that those groups are historically undercounted in the census. So in 1990, or rather in the year 2000, the true proportion was probably 40%. And the majority of children under the age of 15 are people who are considered people of color. Conservatives, many Americans don't like this. Bill O'Reilly, after Obama was reelected, I remember watching the election in 2012 and flipping over to Fox News after they called the election for Obama, because I wanted to see how are they greeting this news. And Bill O'Reilly said the demographics are changing. It's not a traditional America anymore. The white establishment is now a minority. And the fear of this major demographic change has led to this big debate or concern: who is really an American? And we can't understand white nationalism unless we understand the deep anxiety over the nation's changing demography. In fact, I would argue that you wouldn't understand President Trump and how he could become president if we don't understand it as a backlash to this changing demography and the fact that we have this Black man who now represents America. Trump, during his campaign, engaged in textbook racism. That's not my term. It's Paul Ryan, who is hardly a social liberal. You remember his attacks on Mexican rapists, calling for building the wall, instituting a Muslim travel ban, and integrating a so-called Mexican judge who was actually a US citizen, calling Black urban neighborhoods hotbeds of violence and promising to go after bad hombres who were infestations in our nation. White nationalism is a direct response to the culture shock that's engulfing our nation. In Charlottesville, they proclaimed, "You will not replace us." And Trump declaring in 2017, "I am a nationalist." White nationalism is the response to this changing demography. White nationalism, you can talk about it in many different ways, but it's really a desire for a white utopia. As we see in these this snapshot from a campaign rally, from a Trump rally after he was elected, these two t-shirts saying, "I'd rather be Russian than Democrat." That there are people, let that sink in. There are people in our country who would rather live in a white, totalitarian, authoritarian state than in a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy. Let that sink in. Now, white nationalism can be defined in many ways, but it's basically not simply a matter of hate, it's a matter of who belongs here, whose country is this? White nationalism is that non-rational, instinctual, visceral conviction that this country, its public spaces, its institutions, its heritage, it belongs to white people in a way that it does not and should not belong to others. It's not foremost a matter of hate, but a matter of belonging. Whose country is this? As we're going to see later, whose church is this? White nationalism says that people of color can be present in American life, but if they're present only by permission or toleration in terms of limited numbers or or doing essential work. Or if they're present, they're there by fraud or deceit, as in the whole birther controversy with Obama. Why doesn't he show his birth certificate, that he was somehow an illegitimate president of the United States? But I want to pause and make us understand the issue isn't Trump, it's us, or it's America. Because Trump is but a symptom. As I tell people, Trump is not an aberration, he's an exaggeration of what's going on in America. So you hear people say things like, he talks like I do. He says out loud what I'm thinking. He says in public what I say at home. He puts into words what I feel. He talks the way people do at their kitchen tables. Or my favorite one, I don't agree with how he says things, but don't you think he has a point? In other words, if we focus on Trump alone, we're missing the picture. Trump is not an aberration, he's an exaggeration of this tendency in American life. So the first thing that's going on is this rise of white nationalism. But then let's look at, let's go back here. COVID. I was so happy that Aiden asked me to do this because it gave me a chance to look at what's going on in our country even now. We see even now the racial disparities that we see in this pandemic. All are affected by this pandemic, make no mistake about it, but we are not equally affected. The pandemic is not an equalizer, it's an exacerbator. Over and over again in this country, throughout this country, we're seeing severe racial disparities in this disease's impact. In Milwaukee, my home city, African Americans are 26% of the population, but 50% of the infections and 81% of the deaths. This is up till now. Chicago, African Americans are 30% of the population, but 52% of the infections and 72% of the deaths. The mayor of Chicago was just on NPR News giving this information. In the state of Michigan, African Americans are 14% of the population, but 35% of the infections, 45% of the deaths. Louisiana, another major hotspot, African Americans are 33% of the population, but 70% of those who have died. Similar reports are found on Native reservations. And this information is incomplete because many jurisdictions don't record the race and ethnicity of those who are the victims of COVID-19. But already we're seeing, even from the limited data that we have, that this is not an equalizer, but an exacerbator. But why? Partial list. Racial and ethnic minorities are among those most afflicted with underlying conditions such as asthma, heart disease, and diabetes, which aggravate the disease. We also know that racial and ethnic minorities are those most likely to have a lack of health insurance or a lack of a regular health care provider. They're also less likely to have access to accurate information about this disease. Internet access, as we know, is a real digital divide in our country. We also know that many African Americans and other racial minorities live in overcrowded living conditions. They're unable to self-isolate. I have a student who is a Latina, and she's living with her mother in a one-room apartment, and her mother has come down sick with COVID, and she can't self-isolate. I mean, what can you do in that kind of limited situation? So if one person in the family gets sick, it's likely to spread throughout the whole family. Many African Americans and persons of color are dependent upon public transportation. And that means you're going to be more exposed to those who are likely to be infected with the virus. Also, many cannot work at home. They're considered essential workers, even if low wage, and that increases their exposure. One of the things we should be aware of is who's considered essential. And one of the things that we need to look at is that many of the most essential workers are also those who are the least well paid in our society. Many have no sick leave, no benefits. They have to work. If they don't show up to work, they're not getting paid. So many will go to work even if it puts themselves at risk. And also there's rumors that this is a white people's disease and that Black people don't get it. I myself heard this about 3 weeks ago, the last time I had a haircut. I'm glad my screen is not high resolution, so you can't see the beginnings of an afro coming in. But the rumor is that this is a white people's disease. And again, the lack of accurate information means that people don't always take care of themselves, and we can't correct these rumors and when they arise. This is a partial list. But there are other impacts besides death and disparate impact of disease. As I said before, undocumented farm workers are among the workers who are considered essential. The most essential workers during this epidemic are among the least paid, the least prestigious, the least respected, and the most at risk. So we're seeing delivery persons, we're seeing Amazon workers, many of them who are African American and Latino and young, who have to go to work and oftentimes in situations where they don't have adequate protection. One sees now many African American men who don't want to wear masks, because when African Americans and people of color wear masks, that exacerbates the racial stereotypes that people have of us and perceive us as being dangerous. Just again today, I heard in news reports of 3 Black men who were kicked out of an Illinois Walmart because they were wearing masks, because they were doing what they were told to do to protect themselves, when sees the police officer here escorting them out of the Walmart because they look suspicious because they're wearing a mask. And then again, we can't ignore how Asian hate crimes have spiked in this pandemic, especially because the president and other conservative commentators insist upon calling it the Chinese virus. And therefore, Asian Americans, even if they're not Chinese, are being subject to hate crimes. All of this is to say that a concern for racism can't stop simply because we're in a pandemic, because a pandemic exacerbates the already existing racial inequalities that are present in our nation. Now with that then, let's look at the Catholic Church's response to racism. Open wide our hearts. The first thing to understand about Open Wide Our Hearts is that even though it's the first pastoral letter since 1979, it wasn't the first attempt at writing a pastoral letter. Between 2001 and 2005, I worked with the bishops on a pastoral letter on racism. It was even given tentatively titled, "The Truth Will Make You Free." And I wrote and went through 4 drafts of the document. At the final document was at 4 years later, is rejected by the bishops because it focused on white privilege, ecclesial racism, and it called for a study of reparations. Not even for giving reparations, it's called for a study of it. One of the bishops said, "If we say, Father, what you want us to say, my people will get mad." As I said to the Black bishops afterwards, I said, reading between the lines of the various interventions of the bishops, one has to wonder whether any statement that forthrightly addressed the central dynamics of race would ever garner the support of the majority of the nation's bishops. That's back in 2005. Flash forward then to 2017. The first drafting committee, they asked Professor Sean Copeland, a noted African-American scholar, one of the foremost scholars in the United States Church, a retired professor from Boston College, good friend of mine, dear mentor, to chair the drafting committee. She wrote a first draft of the letter, but then there was a controversy that arose because conservative groups discovered that in one of her books, she had taken a positive stance for LGBTQ equality. And a statement that got her in trouble, quote unquote, is that if Jesus of Nazareth is not an option for LGBTQ persons, then he's not an option. The right-wing website Church Militant went after her with a vengeance. It got her fired or canceled a speech she was going to give at her alma mater, Madonna College in Detroit. And subsequently then she was removed as the chair of the committee. The draft that she wrote was completely discarded. Her work became radioactive. Because one of the things we have to understand about the Catholic Church is that if you're not seen as orthodox by them on sexual issues, they won't use you on any issue, including race. What happened after that, there was a new drafting committee that was named, but the names were never released. The names of the lay consultants of the committee have never been publicly identified, but a major source of mine from the USCCB told me that no major scholar on racism was consulted. People often ask me, was I consulted at all with this document? And I say, nope, not at all. No major scholar on racism, no African-American scholar, no major Latino scholar on racism was consulted in drafting this document. So what do we see in this document, Open Wide Our Hearts? It says some good things. It says, one, that love compels us to confront racism courageously. It's very good. It also calls racism a life issue. And that's a great breakthrough. But again, the bishops were just catching up because when Pope John Paul II paid his last pastoral visit to the United States, he had already called racism a life issue. So he said this in 1999. The bishops finally in 2018 made that teaching their own. However, then we get into some problematic things. They came to Confederate monuments. They said that these were a matter of heritage, that local communities should decide whether they should remove them, despite the fact that the Confederate flag and Confederate monuments were erected and have been used as symbols of white supremacy and as protests against civil rights. There is no mention of white nationalism in the document at all, despite the major protests that were going on, had happened in Charlottesville, despite the president calling himself a nationalist, there's no mention of it. There's no mention of white privilege in the document. The phrase never appears. There's no mention about how white people are harmed by racism. Indeed, when we look at how white people are presented in the document, they're either absent or they're passive, and I'll say more about that later, or they're presented as saviors who did the right thing. There's no mention of the Black Lives Matter movement at all. You would never know that this movement had taken place in the United States if you read this letter. They would say they call upon us to welcome immigrants, but there's no criticism of the Trump administration's policies that have led to an unwelcome of immigrants or safeguarding of immigrants. We also see that there's muted rhetoric for some issues. They say that they call for the plain, they acknowledge that the plain truth is that African Americans have often had fraught encounters with the police, but note that they can reject the harsh rhetoric against law enforcement and condemn police violent attacks at police. They never condemn police violence itself. They affirm that participating in right-wing neo-Nazi movements is against church doctrine, but they never condemn these movements directly. There's no account of pervasive police violence, despite the fact that by 2016, over 24 Department of Justice investigations of police departments have been conducted. People have also called attention to the passive voice that predominates in the document. It's as if racism just happens. So you see statements like, people are still being harmed, so action is still needed. Who's harming them? They say, as this country is forming, Africans were bought and sold as mere property, often beaten, raped, and worked to death. But by whom or why? They talk about families were separated, marriages were forbidden or dishonored, children were maltreated. Millions of Blacks lived in constant fear of their lives, but they never say why. We see the same thing over and over again. The right to participate in the political process will be withheld or severely hindered for another century, but why? Who did this? Who benefited? And what's the current impact? In other words, throughout the document, racial injustice just happened, past tense, but with no responsibility assigned for it. So what do they call Catholics to do? They call us to encourage others to see, maybe for the first time, those who are on the periphery and to enter into dialogue with those we would not normally seek out. We must form relationships with those we might regularly avoid, but who's the we? They never, this is a document that's written to white Catholics, presumably by white Catholics, for white Catholics, but not for the entire church. They call us to visit museums, teach about racism, to watch our jokes and conversations. We call on theologians to help us address these issues as well. And I have to say that when I first read this, I was reading on my Kindle. I want to take my Kindle and throw it across the room. How can you call upon theologians to address these issues when you won't use our work? But there are no calls for specific systemic changes. There's no mention of voter suppression, no mention of systemic poverty. And so there shouldn't be surprised that there are a number of criticisms. They call racism a life issue, but it's not the preeminent one. That remains abortion. So by calling abortion preeminent, it basically means you can dismiss racism. It doesn't include overtly anyway the voices of people of color. There's no mention of Native peoples, really. It says that many didn't want to join the church, but there's no telling the story from the point of Native peoples. It describes discriminatory treatment experienced by Hispanics, but no discussion of that, how they're treated in the church itself. It does not identify current manifestations of racism in the church at all. What one sees in this document is a major badge of Catholic engagement with race. We engage race only in the ways that don't make white people uncomfortable. White comfort sets the limits of Catholic engagement with racism. It's not that we won't say anything, but whatever we say and whatever we do as calculated in a way that won't make white people uncomfortable. Why? Because of the normative whiteness of the church, that the Catholic Church still understands itself as being predominantly a white community that backs off in deference to the sensitivities of the white community. This was something that Brother Cyprian Lamar Rose said in 1975. As we can see in 2018, not much has changed. As I say in my book that Father Aiden mentioned, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, probably the sentence that's probably the most repeated sentence, what makes the Catholic Church white and racist is the pervasive belief that European aesthetics, music, theology, and persons, and only these, are standard, normative, universal, and truly Catholic. Everybody else, all else, is Catholic by exception. So there's a deep Catholic ambivalence. In 1979, their last statement, they said that racism is not merely one sin among many, it's a radical evil. They don't say anything close to that in their current document. And I said, if racism is a radical evil, where's the evidence for it in our Catholic concern or our Catholic catechesis in our seminary formation? What one finds instead in a Catholic Church is its own deep, unacknowledged complicity in white nationalism. In the Archdiocese of New York, they were wanting to do a parish renewal program, and they were looking for a slogan for the parish renewal program. And one of the priests had a hat made with the slogan, "Make Archdiocese of New York great again."
Oh, God.
So what happened here was that in the priest council, there was one black priest and two Latino priests who were present, and they said, this is a really bad idea. And they were saying, oh, but this is so cute. Our people will understand this. Well, I said, again, who are your people? Fortunately, they did not go with the slogan. There were only 50 of these hats made. But one of my friends who was a pastor of a Harlem parish had one. I said, I need a picture of that, because that in itself tells a story of what we're dealing with in the Catholic Church. So what we see is the Catholic Church is a bystander at best when it comes to white nationalism and white supremacy. So this raises the haunting question. Will it be an effective ally? The only honest answer is probably not. But probably not, because there is another path. The presence and witness of Black Catholics and our allies. Probably does not mean definitely not. It means it's not likely, but it's not impossible. There have always been Black Catholic voices. If you see, here's a picture of Bishop Edward Braxton, the retired Bishop of Belleville, Illinois. He is one of the only bishops that has written pastoral letters, 3 of them to this date, dealing with the Black Lives Matter movement. We see that there are Black Catholics who have been part of the Black Lives Matter movement and Black Lives Matter protests. Xavier University in Louisiana has sponsored an ongoing seminar and symposia looking at Catholic participation in Black Lives Matter. I myself have written a number of articles dealing with how the Catholic Church needs to be a forthright figure in the Black Lives Matter movement. And there are a number of allies, Catholic allies in racial justice. The anti-racism teams of Call to Action and Pax Christi USA, growing interest among Catholic social agencies like Catholic Charities. I mentioned before, Xavier, Louisiana's Symposium on Black Lives Matter. There's increasing activism on Catholic colleges and university campuses. And there are current efforts by some orders of women religious and men, like the Jesuits, the Dominican sisters, and others, to own their own past complicity in slavery and in racial injustice. So we're seeing that there are some efforts going on in the Catholic Church to address these issues. So will the Catholic Church be an effective ally in the struggle against racism and white nationalism? Probably not. But it depends upon who or what you mean by church. If we look at let's go back. If we look at what's going on at the top from our bishops, my belief is we're always going to be disappointed. I think our role as Black Catholics and allies is to be a thorn in the side of the church, to be a prophetic witness in the church, to call our church to a deeper responsibility and deeper fidelity with Jesus Christ. That's our role, that's our mission. And we're not always going to be applauded for it. In fact, a lot of times we're going to be denigrated for it. We're going to be ostracized for it. But as we're entering into Holy Week, we remember that that's part of the price of following Christ. We say in the Black community, no cross, no crown. And this is part of who we mean by church, that we are the church. And we have to own that and be that prophetic presence in the church. I always end with the final words of my book, so just in case you haven't read it, this is how it ends. As we're looking at the memorial of Michael Brown Jr. in the street of Ferguson, where he laid for 4 hours in a hot August sun, you have to remember that social life is made by human beings. And the society we live in is the result of human choices and decisions. This means that human beings can change things. What human beings break, divide, and separate, we can, with God's help, also heal, unite, and restore. What is now does not have to be. And therein lies our hope and our challenge. So I think we have to remember that racism is a present issue. Even in this COVID crisis, we still have to, let me stop the screen share here. Even in this COVID crisis, we still have to remember that the work for racial justice is important, because as this crisis goes on, we're going to see a continued racial disparity in this disease's impact. The cause for racial justice needs our voice and our commitment now more than ever. Even as people say we need to put that aside to deal with the health crisis is also a social crisis. It's also a racial crisis. So I'll stop there and let's have some discussion or questions or comments. So thanks for listening.
Maybe, Brian, we could take maybe a minute just to honor and let what has been said sink into our hearts and souls just for a minute, because it's a lot and powerful, and there's a lot of grist for the grist mill. So let's just take a full minute to in silence just to honor this moment. Let the church say, amen. So I'm acting as the host, and it looks like we actually have 3 pages of people, which means we have about 60 people online. So I think, how will we do this? If you have a screen available and you want to ask a question, either put your hand up, or if you're really familiar with Zoom, there's an ability on there to put your hand up electronically, and I will just try to come to you as, or can you see that too, Brian?
No, I can't see it, but you as host can see it. Or they can also type in their questions in the chat function too. They can send a chat with their question as well.
Right. Okay. Oh, good. So it's, can everybody see that? Can you nod if you can see to the, yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
you can, at the bottom of your screen, it says
So
a chat
there's-
there. You can hit there and you can type a message there and it goes to everyone and we can see it then on the screen too. So that's another way of doing it too.
Okay. So, so Susan Wiley is saying yes. So do we have a question? I know Denise is just dying to say something. Do you want to unmute yourself, Denise? I will unmute you.
Yes, I'm so happy that you did this presentation, and I'm very happy to be in the Just Faith class on Thursday night. This really highlights some of the things I'm experiencing. I think I said last Thursday when we were sharing that I thought Condo 19 would be the equal opportunity equalizer that would bring us together. But what I'm seeing is the same thing you're seeing in Milwaukee, the same thing my friend Van Jones came out and talked about today. It's just seeing the treatment of our patients, if they're people of color, the African Americans, and how they're being treated. In Africa, they were rising up around refusal to be guinea pigs for testing, which was brought up by the French doctors in the same process. And in our country, what's being highlighted in Nigeria is a young Nigerian student. He was due to graduate as an engineer in 2 weeks. Basically, he was asking for testing. He never received it, and as a result, he died. I wanted to see how can we do something and make that change as African American Catholics who are social activists, and also our allies. And how do you see the African Catholic Church? You know, for every, I mean, the Africans are the predominantly Black face of the Catholic Church increasingly in this country. And how do you see them as allies? And are they understanding what you're talking about when you present this material? Thank you, and I'll take my answer off the air. Thank you, Father Aiden.
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I think one of the things that we need to understand is that we are just now beginning to pay attention to this disease's racial disparities and impact. Now, in some ways, it shouldn't surprise us because persons of African descent have long experienced healthcare disparities from the healthcare system. We know that we don't always get equal treatment. I think part of the problem is that there's a deep suspicion among communities of color of the healthcare system, and that's not unwarranted. The other thing we need to watch is the fact that we hear a lot about triage because there aren't enough ventilators and equipment to go around and treat everyone. So one of the things that people are very, very concerned about is who will make these decisions about who gets treatment, and will implicit bias, racial bias, be a factor in determining who gets treatment and who doesn't get treatment. In terms of what we need to do, the Congressional Black Caucus is now paying attention to this issue. And one of the things I think that we as Catholic activists need to do is to join with those in the Congressional Black Caucus and in other groups that are raising the flag on this. The least we can do is that we need to demand that every locality keep an accurate record in recording the race and ethnicity of those who are impacted. We don't even know the true extent because many places won't even record that information. We need that information. The second thing we need to do, and we can do this in a Paris situation, is to combat misinformation that's out there. There's a lot of misinformation that's said among our people about this is a disease that doesn't really affect us. Or you see young men who are still not keeping social distancing norms and things like that. We need to challenge that kind of behavior and challenge that kind of misinformation. But we also need to join our voices with the Congressional Black Caucus, and we also need to demand that our local authorities keep statistics about race and ethnicity. So we don't have that information, then we're going to be covering up the disparate impact. So those are some of the things I would say off the bat. So thank you. I see in the chat that someone named Meg Bowerman has said that some of the parish have been reading White Fragility in a Just Faith program, and echoes a lot of what I've said. I'm glad that you're seeing that this is happening in many different, that there's a lot of information that's very much kind of converging and seeing this, and that's a very good program. I think it's not as critical of the church's response as it could be and should be, but I think it's a good program.
Brian, don't you think that?
I think Audrey had her hand up here.
Oh,
Audrey
okay.
Mamoth, did you have your hand up or not?
Yes, you did. Yeah, Audrey. Go ahead, Audrey.
One, I wanted to thank you again. You dedicated your life to this and to supporting the Black community and communities of color in general. And I wish I could give you a hug.
Here's one from a distance. Okay.
As Father says, just hug ourselves. At my job, we've been talking about it offline a lot more, is that counties, as you said, they don't collect data on who is dying and who's getting treatment. We don't even know how many people in Alameda County are from Oakland. They won't tell us. And they don't know. So I guess I worry about our community because we're only like 12% of the entire US population, but we continue to be the first to die. And so I wonder, what would you want to pressure, for example, maybe local government to do? And how can we as citizens best push our elected leaders to make decisions that are best for all of us?
Audrey, before Father answers that question, you should tell him what your job is.
I work for the mayor.
You work for the mayor of Oakland. That's
Oh,
not a bad thing,
so you
but
got
full
a front
disclosure.
Okay, so you have a front, so you're there when the sausage is being made. Great. I think every local situation is different and unique, and so I don't want to give a blanket answer in terms of what should be happening. But I think, as I said before, information. If we don't have the information, then we're always shooting in the dark. And so, as you said, they don't even tell you like how many victims are from the city of Oakland. Then how can you make how can you do anything if you don't know who the population that's being affected is? You can't. For the life of me, I don't understand. I know I do understand. I understand why they don't want that information being out there, because if they get the information out there, then people will really be upset and ask some really difficult questions. But information is really key. The other thing we learned from the AIDS epidemic, and that is, if the messaging around that epidemic at first was targeted toward a group of white gay men, it was presumed that everyone who was infected with this disease was white or was a white gay male predominantly. And we know that from the beginning, the disease had disproportionate impact on communities of color. It wasn't until they began targeting their safer sex messages and using community-sensitive advertising, in other words, the talking in ways in which our people would understand and communicate, then it wasn't until then that we made some inroads in reducing the level of HIV infections. I think we need to do the same thing when it comes to this COVID. If we simply target advertising about safety and about distancing or hand washing and all these other things, only in terms of assuming that our audience is white and not using culturally sensitive and specific ways of speaking, then we're not doing our job. So I would say, one, information. Two, we need to find ways to communicate the information to keep people safe. in community sensitive ways. We did that much, we can make a major impact, I think. I noticed that there's a question that came in, a large one about the Trump campaign being focused on the Catholic vote, especially in swing states. How can Catholics do the pushback, and how do we work collectively? Yeah. One of the things we need to understand, and I'm working on an article now, and my headline for this is that racism and misogyny got us into this mess. And the reason why I want to say it that way is because Trump would not be president if it weren't for racism and misogyny. Trump was elected president because he was, the anti-Obama. Trump is now trying to create a United States in which the Obama presidency never happened. So that's one of the reasons why he dismantled the unit that was responsible for tracking pandemics in the National Security Council. And we can't, I don't think we have to be honest and say that this crisis would not unfold the way it has under a President Clinton. Now, you may like Hillary Clinton for any number of reasons, but you have to say that she'd be far more competent about this than our current occupant. So racism and misogyny are killing us. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is because Trump was elected with the majority of votes of white Catholics. The majority of white Catholics voted for Trump. And they did it under the guise of being pro-life, which means anti-abortion. And I think, and we see many of our bishops who are still falling into that kind of rhetoric. I think we need to challenge and push back on that and say, it is not pro-life to separate families. It is not pro-life to put children in cages. It is not pro-life to, this is just ridiculous. It's not pro-life to fire a Navy captain who is simply trying to protect his sailors. I think we need to be forthright about this, and we need to realize that racism and misogyny are killing us. We are paying a high price for our country's commitment to racism and its commitment to misogyny. As I said, I'll probably get in trouble for writing that, but I just think we need to be very blunt about this because this is killing us. Yet to Margaret, yet to address the bishop's pastoral on racism. Yes, I did. And so this is being recorded. And I said to Father Aiden that the presentation, the PowerPoint, I'll send it to him and he can take care of getting it distributed to the right people. So absolutely.
Do you see that one, Brian? Not being Catholic, I always wondered if the Catholic Church see Black people as members
or as guests. Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing. Does it see Catholic people as members or guests? I would say that we are seen as, the best way of putting it is we're seen as stepchildren. I think that's the best way of putting it. We're seen as stepchildren. We're not seen as equal members of the Catholic Church. I just think that's a very honest way of putting it. That the church is still, I would say that white nationalism is a reality in the church in that it's still predominantly or seen to be a white church predominantly, and that Black people are welcome in white people's home, which is the Catholic Church, but we have to understand that it's their rules. They were not seen as fully equal members yet. Will it change? I think that there are two ways to answer the question. One is to say, maybe not on the macro level, Although I think if the Catholic Church doesn't change on a macro level, it's choosing slow death, frankly. Because the majority of Catholics in the country right now are not white. So if it doesn't change, it's going to choose slow death. But the other is that I myself refuse to be treated as a guest in my own house. That I'm going to make myself welcome in this house. I'm going to make this my house, whether they want me to be there or not. So I think it will change, because it'll be those of us who refuse to be treated as guests in our own house. As I said, the question is, who or what do we mean by church? And as long as we think the church is simply a group of bishops, then the answer is always going to be no. But if we say that we are the church, then I think we've answered the question in a very different way. I see Jazzy saying that, thank you for bringing up the Navy commander. Well, yes, I think that we need to understand that what we're seeing now, one of the ways, if this thing has any silver lining, I was thinking about this the other day when I was thinking about the plagues in Egypt. That the biblical plagues were always used to lay bare the injustices in a society that the society was not willing to confront. The slavery existed in Egypt, and the plagues were there. They laid bare, they revealed what was already going on. And the whole point of a plague was not to go back to normal. The whole point was to create a new way of being, a new society. And one of the things I'm hopeful for, or at least, is that this plague that we're experiencing is revealing what we've all known. You have, a rather incompetent, racist president. Now we're seeing it being revealed in real vivid color. And I would hope that we don't go back to normal, because normal wasn't that healthy or just to begin with. I think we need to seize this as a moment of saying, normal is what got us into this mess. And now we have to use this as an opportunity to move forward in a new direction. Now that won't be easy. So remember in the story, Pharaoh resisted mightily. And we should expect to see that in the current situation, but hopefully we can see this as an opportunity, the beginning of a new process or a new way of being. Where can we buy the book? I see you can buy it on Amazon. This book is selling it. It's called Racial Justice in the Catholic Church. Buy it on Amazon, and next time I'm at St. Columba's, I'll be happy to sign it for you. So see that as an incentive. Let's see.
Scotland.
Let's see. The majority Black and brown Catholics, the colonials always stuck with me. Okay, yeah. There's something from Joyce about the fact the majority of Black and brown Catholics were Catholics as a result of colonialism. Yes and no. It's true that in Africa and in South America, in particular, the church came as an imposition of European colonization. That's absolutely true. However, it's also true that those folks did not just take Catholicism as a given. In other words, they took what was given to them and they reshaped it then in light of their own situation. Just as, for example, in the United States, many African slaves were exposed to Christianity, forced to be Christian because their masters were Christian, but we know that their understanding of Christianity was never that of their masters. They always took what was given to them and reshaped it in light of their situation, in light of their own experience of God. So yes, colonialism and slavery, enslavement may have been the way in which we got into the church, was not the reason why we stay in the church. We stay in the church because we've made this faith our own. We've reshaped it. And what you're doing at St. Columba's is, an example of that reshaping that's going on. Let's see. Okay, someone just thanked me for my work. Thank you for this opportunity. This is really exciting, you know, to be able to do something like this. Do I see typical diocesan structures, parishes as pragmatic means or extra parish institutions or based communities? I would say it's not in either. Thank you, Jeff, for that question. I would say it's not in either or, it's a both and. In other words, I would say that the typical parish structure that exists in mainstream Catholicism is probably not going to be very effective. And this is why communities like St. Columba's are so important, because it's not the typical mainstream experience of Catholicism. And so I think we need parishes like St. Columba's to nurture people's social justice activism. I think we also need to look at other groups that are present in the Catholic Church, such as Call to Action, Pax Christi USA, and others who can be, I'm blanking out on the community organizing group that we're,
OCO,
yeah, OCO, yeah.
PICO.
And what's the national one? PICO?
PICO.
Faith in
Yeah,
Action.
right.
PICO.
And so there are a number, yeah, got it. And so there are a number of groups like that. So it's not a matter of either or, it's both and. I think the extra parish groups are important because if you belong to a parish where that kind of activism isn't tolerated or supported, then you need somewhere to go for support. But I would hope that we don't want to leave parishes off the hook. But unfortunately, given the current leadership of the church and given what's happening in Catholic seminary formation, it's not likely that priests are going to come out of seminaries being social justice activists. Because if they were social justice activists, they probably wouldn't be in the seminary. They wouldn't be admitted to the seminary. I'm just being honest here. It's truth.
Brian, don't you think that a lot of what the bishops are about, even though it is code for our people wouldn't like it, meaning the money won't flow into their diocese, it is really about power and money wrapped around the issue of race. And also, right now, the USCCB is mostly anti-Francis, even though he has a lot. And we see that over and over again. And in our parish structure, we opposed the closing of St. Martin de Porres School because it was serving Black and brown children. But when we rose up and spoke loudly, those whose heads rose up, including my own, got chopped off. And it was very clear, you're against me, and therefore, and then our community voted with its finances and its resources and did not give to the Bishop of Peel, which he personally interpreted as, you're not with me. He felt alienated from us. And then eventually we sent him a letter, it took 6 months to work on a letter about the issues of the Catholic Church and the local response to those abused by priests and others. And it took a lot of massaging, and eventually he came here. We prayed with him, we talked with him, and he left feeling like he was bonded with us again because we went out of our way. But he didn't do anything really he showed up. Mm-hmm. But he sees us as other. It's very clear. We are not. He has asked me on numerous occasions to do things in the Roman rite, and wanted me to promise that I would do things. Some of them I've done, some of them I haven't. But I told him he puts me in a very untenable position, and he doesn't get it. No. And even recently, we asked him if we could invite the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. to come and preside over our 40th anniversary. And his response through his secretary was, "Oh, don't bother him. You know, why don't you just get some local black auxiliary bishop somewhere rather than bothering the archbishop? He's too busy." And you
There
know what
aren't
my
our
response
local
was?
black auxiliary bishops in California.
Well, I
Okay,
know,
that's
I
part of the
know, I know.
problem. So let's just name that for what it is. Okay,
Right.
but there aren't any. Okay, so Aiden, you're absolutely right. I think that it's something we need to understand and be very clear about. If we do this work for justice, we are not going to be popular. If we do this work for justice, we're not going to be popular. If we tell uncomfortable truths, but necessary truths, we're not going to be popular. We're always going to be seen as the outsider, the other, the pariah, the troublemaker, the angry black man, the angry black woman, the N-word lover. I mean, all kinds of things. These are all the things that have been done throughout history to ostracize people who would stand up for themselves. And when you're calling out racism and white supremacy, you're going to pay a price. And if we're not, sometimes when I get down on myself, when I feel like, that a diocese cancels out of a speaking invitation or something like that, and I feel sorry for myself, friends like me remind me saying, this shows you're doing your job. It shows you're doing your job. And then when you have those very uncomfortable conversations with your bishop, I mean, I remember once talking to my archbishop. He had heard that I won an award for something, and he called me in his office, and I thought he was going to congratulate me. And he said, "Yeah, I saw they gave you this award. They said you're prophetic. That means you're a fucking troublemaker." Excuse me, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that out loud. But now you know how bishops talk, okay? He said that, okay? That's what he said. And I was like,
It's real.
Archbishop, I mean, one, my ears, but two, but that was his understanding. And at first I was like wondering, like, really? That this is your response when a priest of your diocese gets a national award, is to say that means you're a troublemaker. And I have to be honest, it hurt. It really stung. But I do think that it just drove home to me the fact that if we're not getting pushback, then we're not doing our job. And I think what we need to do is find ways to hug each other, hold each other, support each other, uplift each other, to keep us going when we get that kind of pushback, because we're going to get that kind of pushback. And again, I apologize, it slipped out of my mouth.
Okay.
I was just quoting an archbishop, so you don't get in trouble.
It's not a sin. Not a sin when you quote.
It's not a sin when I quote. I know, yes, I know. But still, I mean, it's late here in New York, so I have to be careful. I mean, my filters, it's 10 o'clock here, and you guys are still.
You know, one of our priests said to me at a meeting, I don't go to the meetings anymore, but just because, I find my head sitting on my hands and trying to keep my mouth shut, and that doesn't work very well sometimes. One of our Indian priests says, "Why don't you just shut your bloody mouth? You're always talking." And I'm like, I looked at him, I was kind of shocked, and I hadn't even said much at the meeting, so. But anyway, that should not deter us from speaking truth to power. Does anybody else have questions? Marian Castelluccio, I saw you were unmuted for a moment.
I was starting to write a question in. First of all, I am so grateful for this conversation because racism is so systemic to all issues. I can't talk about any issue without addressing the racism aspect of that. I mean, I function as a psychiatric social worker. I supported families who had loved ones murdered in the streets of Oakland. I mean, you cannot address any issue if I am not willing to look at white supremacy, my own participation in privilege, just because the fact is I'm Irish Italian, blah, blah, blah. So I really appreciated all of the remarks showing that we cannot say, well, this pandemic is more important than addressing the basic issue of racism. Because you know the people out there in the tents and streets and who don't have stuff are going to be people of color. The majority of them are going to be people of color. Who's taking care that they get masks and all of those kinds of things. And so I really appreciate the focus that there is no issue we can speak about that says to us this is not impacted by racism.
Oh, absolutely. That whenever you scratch any injustice or social justice challenge that's facing our country or our communities, and you're going to find racism, you know, right there. Educational disparity, racism. One of the things that happened with this move, like with COVID, with this move, with the closing of the New York City public school system here, and the move to online education, they realized that there were 300,000 kids that didn't have a computer and didn't have access to the internet, so they couldn't move online for instruction. And so then what they did, they found donors to give 300,000 computers to these students. And you want to say, okay, why couldn't you have done that in the first place? Why couldn't you have done that in the first place? Or looking at Amazon right now.
I'm sorry, I have to interrupt and say amen, 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 amen.
We're looking at Amazon, the Amazon workers, okay, that in order for, because they're essential workers, they said, okay, we're going to give you a $2 an hour pay increase. Okay, why couldn't, well, one, it's not nearly enough to put your life in danger, but my thing is, why didn't you have paid them $2 more in the first place?
Not more.
Well, far more, but the thing is, what we're seeing now is we're bending over backwards, doing things that should have been done before. And we're seeing that the people who have been most impacted by this are communities of color. That when I looked at the lines of those kids who are lined up to get these free computers, I didn't see any white faces. And I didn't see any Asian faces. They were Black and brown faces. And the same thing when we saw we had a protest here where the Amazon workers walked off their jobs because of the poor working conditions, the unsafe working conditions. They weren't giving them the mask and the gloves and things like that. And again, they were overwhelmingly Black and brown faces. And so I think that, again, we can't look upon this when people would say, this is a health issue, don't bring race into it. Race is in it. And if we don't deal with race, then we're not dealing with the health crisis. One of the things we need to understand is that these people, these delivery people who are delivering our packages and stocking our grocery stores and all of this, if they get sick, we get sick. So what we're finding out is that this lack of universal health care, everyone says it's going to disproportionately benefit the poor. If the poor get sick, that affects the health of all of us.
Oh, man.
Only we can find recover a sense of solidarity and what that really means. In a pandemic, you can run to your mountainside villa or whatever like that, but you're not going to be able to escape a disease. And I think this is something that we as human beings need to learn. That, I'm not saying God brought this in to teach us a lesson, but I'm saying that because I don't believe in that kind of God. But I do think that we need to understand that we are in this together. And as Martin Luther King said, we either learn to live together as brothers and sisters, or we will perish together as fools. And I think now we're seeing that King had some real insight that we're only now beginning to catch up to.
Is Andrew Peters? Andrew, are you wanting to ask a question? Maybe it's Francine.
No.
Oh. Well, we do have Pope Francis, Brian, going back to the church.
Mm.
That's my, and when I talk about priests and we talk about the difficulties and the current lack and the seminary formation system and the clericalism and the privilege, but we always, there's something about that, being able to go back and say, well, we have Pope Francis.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he has that idea that the church should not be centralized in Rome. It should be a synodal church. We should be a church that works together. We saw that in the Amazon. We didn't get the results I thought we were going to get, but I think we're moving in the right direction. He is pushing the church in the right direction, but there's tremendous pushback from those who would lose power.
Mm-hmm. And I think that you're right that Pope Francis represents, I think progressives tend to become very upset with Pope Francis because he's not moving fast enough. And I think one of the things that I have to remember is that the conservatives see him as the threat that he really is. He's creating the conditions for the possibility for greater movement. At least there's a space in the church for conversations that were before were outlawed and seen as taboo. So yeah, I don't think that, like, the metaphor I use is, I had to grow up learning how to play football, is that Pope Francis isn't the one who's going to take the ball into the end zone, but he's allowing other people to run with the ball. And I think that's a helpful metaphor for understanding it. And I think conservatives see this as a real threat. They absolutely do, because they see that if you take Francis to his logical conclusion, it's a very different kind of church. And I think what Francis is also trying to free us is to say, it's not up to people in Rome or in our chanceries to make all the decisions, that we are empowered to live our own baptismal calls.
Amen.
We are called to, I don't want to beat up on bishops for not saying, well, I do. I mean, I want to call them, I want to call them to account. But I'm not going to use their irresponsibility or lack of action as an excuse to not be a person of action myself.
Yeah.
I think that's what I'm trying to say.
You know what would give me great joy? I don't want to see Francis die, of course, and we all have to go home to God and our eternal reward at some point. And I hope he has another couple of years to have a few more consistories. I would love to see him make a woman a cardinal, because there's nothing in the rules that say that you couldn't have a big number of women in there. But anyway.
I want to see him make you a cardinal, Aiden. That'd be wonderful.
Let's not go there, Father.
No, that'd be wonderful. You can fly me to Rome. I could have a free trip. That'd be great.
Oh, yeah, you could go. You're not a Jesuit.
You can also St. Columbus would be there too. That'd be wonderful. We got a party in
but
Rome.
But if Francis did go home to God, who has the possibility of being our next pope? Could be Cardinal Turkson. And I'm like, okay then. We had a black president, and now we have a black pope.
Again, yes.
Again. Well, yes, there was.
Again.
Right. I wanted to say, Brian, that I was appreciating you talking about the normal, that going back to something is not an option. I think it's important in this moment to understand that, whatever, even little incremental things that have changed, that we have to keep pushing, because like Karen was saying in her preaching 2 weekends ago, take advantage of the crisis and push it forward. This is a prophetic opportunity for us. So thank you for the words.
Yes, and not only that, but it's also a matter when we realize our national survival is at stake. We're seeing now the price we pay when we don't have adequate health care for all. We're seeing the price. We're seeing the price that happens when we make healthcare tied to employment. That means when people are out of work, then they lose their benefits.
Right.
We're seeing what happens when we don't have adequate public transportation systems. We're seeing the effects of tolerating gross disparities in our society, and how in a moment like this, they say that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. When the people at the so-called bottom of society become weak and ill, all of us do. This has ramifications across the board. We're seeing that right now in New York, 25% of our police are out sick. We're seeing that over 30% of our EMTs, of our ambulance drivers, are out sick. We're seeing that delivery people are going out sick. Grocery stockers are dying. And we're seeing that when those who are having the least prestige in our society, when they start crumbling, the whole edifice falls apart. I think we need to learn that lesson, that we know that we can't just go back to the way things were.
Karen has her hand raised. I don't know what Karen that is. Karen? Karen? Karen. Who else has a question?
There's what's a Cressida Reed?
Cressida Reed.
Can you unmute yourself, Cressida?
Hi, thank you so much for spending this time with us. This might be a little off topic, but I'm so curious. You're in New York.
I am, yes.
Are you sheltering in? Are you okay?
Thank you for
You're
asking.
not likely to get a test or a ventilator or any of those things you pointed out so astutely this evening. So how are you faring?
Oh, thank you so much for asking. It is a really surreal experience living in New York, and I live in Manhattan, so I'm right in New York. It is surreal to walk the streets, and the streets are deserted. I mean, there is no traffic. Usually what's bustling, the only noise we hear now are the noises of sirens, of ambulances going through the city. That's really the only noise that happens. I am safe. I'm fine in my apartment. I've got, enough, food and water. I'm fortunate that because, the university is still functioning. I still teach my classes. I teach them remotely. So I'm getting to be a very good expert on Zoom. I'm really worried though, because my students are now scattered across 3 time zones because the university closed. They all had to go home. Several of my students just this week have told me that they themselves are sick with COVID. Another one of my students is living in a 1-room apartment with her mother who's sick with COVID. And she just told me today that she's now sick with it. Many of them have lost, our families are in deep financial straits because their parents have lost their jobs, or they've, restaurants here, all small businesses have closed, and many of them don't have their wherewithal to keep paying their employees. I'm lucky because the University I work for, Fordham, has made a commitment to pay their employees, and they're going to, so that I'm, very fortunate that way that, I have enough to, meet my expenses, but I know I'm one of the lucky ones. Living alone is sometimes a mixed blessing. Sometimes it feels very lonely, but sometimes it's like thank God, because I think who would I want to live with for 24 hours a day? I'm just being honest here. I've got friends who tell me that they're finding out things about their significant others that they never knew before and wish they had never found out. So I think, but overall, I think I'm doing well. I am very deeply concerned though, because, I do have to say, whenever I leave my apartment, like when I go shopping or something like that, I feel like I'm taking my life in my hands because, we are a major epicenter here. And, this is our life here right now. But I want to say that what's going on in New York is what's going to be the story across the whole country, really. We are unique only in that we're the first.
Yeah, this is our story, that mixed blessing. I've been in this house 4 weeks. San Francisco is the same ghost town. I truly do feel, as I put on my hazmat gear and leave the house, that I am taking my life, into my hands. I already had my list, and then today Fauci added Black to the list, and I was like, statistically, I probably could have figured that out if I had thought about it, but wow. And, that is the one thing that he is doing, that he's very smart, man. And over the weekend, he's been on social media. So he's been with Trevor Noah, and he's been with some of the Black DJs, and like you said, delivering the message in our language to our youth. I was really happy to see him doing that over the weekends recently, because, yeah, they're not listening and they're invincible. I was out today. For the longest I've been out, and no one had on masks, and my town is predominantly Black and brown people, and there was me and the white folks with masks on, and I'm like, okay, well, there you go. So yeah, really.
And part of the problem too is access to those kinds of supplies too, because I know when I go to our local drugstore here, they don't have them. They're you can't get them. So I basically am taking, my neck scarves I use in the wintertime and repurpose them and put it around my face. But I also want to go back to something I said earlier in the presentation. There are many Black and brown young men particularly who don't want to wear them because it makes them look suspicious. And in certain neighborhoods, I was talking about this also in Los Angeles, if you wear the wrong color mask, it seems that you identify yourself as being belonging to the wrong gang, and that can make you sign you up for danger. So I think that these things need to be, we've got so much work to do. But I do think that we need to be attentive to the racial dynamics of this disease, because it's real. It's very, very, very real. And I see someone raised domestic abuse. Absolutely. One of the things that's coming up now is that, it's one thing. One of my students talked to me. We've had a couple of students at Fordham who are living in abusive situations, and they didn't want to leave the dorm because they didn't want to go back home to these abusive situations. And so Fordham found a way to kind of keep them in a residence hall so they wouldn't have to go back. I've got students who are living in homes where there's active alcoholism and substance abuse issues. These are the kinds of the hidden effects of this disease. That sheltering in place sounds good in theory, but then it's like, who are you in shelter with? Becomes an operative question. And how do we continue to provide services especially for the victims of domestic abuse and violence? I know this is an ongoing kind of concern that we need to keep in the forefront of our consciousness. I see Audrey has her hand up. Her Father Aiden.
Audrey.
I wanted to go back to that resource question, because I feel like there's a gap between the number of resources available and the access that people of color, especially our brown and Black community, have. Direct service workers, people who work at grocery stores, there's a testing site explicitly for them that opened up this week. But I asked most people in Oakland, they wouldn't know about that. And so, or like the 211 service for social services, but really it's a great crisis place for people who are in unsafe environments to call and go to, and knowing that they're still operational. Or Keep Oakland House, which is providing rental, like for people who don't want to owe 3 months rent on May 31st when it's all due. They're covering that gap. But how many people know to go there? And I feel like I'm worried in an already gentrifying city that the people who will go there are the people who actually don't necessarily need it as much. And where people of color, and especially our people of color who are undocumented, be hit the hardest. And I'm wondering for the whole group, but also for you, like, are you seeing New York be able to communicate towards the communities that actually need it the most?
I would say that New York is like, we've got some of the same kind of dynamics in terms of information gaps and things like that. And they're really, I think the city now is really rolling out a lot of efforts. For example, like Spanish language translation is really important and really key. And that's something that the city is really working on, being very proactive about. The other thing they're trying to do now more is partner with parishes. So they find out that parishes have a more direct access to some, and not only just Catholic parishes, but churches have a more direct access to communities of color than the government does. And they're also not as suspicious of these churches and pastors. So they're much more using pastors as resources and conduits of information. So I think that those are a couple of ideas that are happening here in New York that might be helpful in your community too, in terms of, you know, using the resources that people trust. And if especially that pastors sometimes know where the groups are that need this information. I think that can be one way of trying to overcome the information gap that is still very real, that's out there.
Brian, when is your new book coming out?
Oh, Aiden, you weren't supposed to ask that question.
Well, I did.
Okay, if you ask me questions, I'll ask you questions you don't want me to ask.
Well, I can mute you and that'll be all over. So.
Mutually assured destruction.
Yeah,
Anyway, okay. It's something I'm working on. I've got it about 3/4 done. I want to, before all of this happened, I had a schedule that it was supposed to get done by the end of May. I have a whole draft done and submit to Orbis Books, but that's going to probably take place, you know, hopefully if the summer is a lighter summer because everything's getting canceled and my calendar frees up a lot. I can finish it by August, and then it should be out sometime in November, December at the latest.
And the title is?
The working title is A Church Where Black Lives Matter, ? So that's the title of the book, working title.
And you're going to use on the cover page the picture of St. Columba's Black Lives Matter poster when it goes back up again? Yes, Father? We won't charge you anything.
You have to send me a copy of it so I can look at it and see whether it's worthy to be on my book.
Oh.
Oh, that
Look at all those faces. Look at all those faces. Oh my God.
Look at all the faces. Okay, everyone's turning up their cameras so I can see.
Father, you were doing real well up to now.
No more free. He's gonna pay for the picture.
It's 11:45 my time, so of course, you know, I'm just tired because I was up at 4 o'clock. Some of us keep a monastic schedule, so we're up and praying. You know.
Please. I could sing Compline with you if you want to right now.
Oh, you could, but you
in Latin as well.
Oh, you could in Latin?
Yeah.
I want to hear that. Yeah.
Oh no.
Denise.
Oh, sorry. I mute myself.
Okay.
So I think everybody is a little tired, but this has been fantastic. Do you have any closing words for us? Or in our direction, we're using, and I have read this myself and used it in preaching, white fragility.
Mm-hmm.
Have you any other recommendations of books for people to read. I know books are not the answer necessarily, but it does help to inform us. But are there any other resources? And is there any question too difficult to ask or get into? That's not a very articulate way of communicating what I'm trying to say, but what's your advice to us as a parish family?
I think my advice to you as a parish family is pray, act, and support. So praying is extremely important because I think that we can't do this work unless we're grounded in something that's bigger and deeper than we are. So we need to pray constantly for justice and pray constantly for strength. We need to act. And by acting, it can be something as simple as raising the impertinent right question at a meeting. It can be writing a letter. There's lots of online activism that's going on right now, so be part of those kinds of things. So acting is really important, but then supporting, and that means supporting each other. Supporting each other because it's going to be difficult, and when we're doing this work, it's a marathon we're involved in. It's not a sprint race. And I think that we need to realize that there are going to be times when we're going to be discouraged and we're going to be tired, and we're not always going to have all the right answers either. We need to support one another in this work. So to pray, to act, and then to support one another. Those would be my last words about that. I saw someone saying that CNN Live tonight had a discussion about Black Lives at High Risk. I've seen that there's more and more information, about 70% in certain locations, absolutely. More and more attention is being given to this. But again, we're only seeing this in isolated. We can make these kinds of conversations because Milwaukee is saying something, Chicago is saying something, Michigan, Louisiana, but we don't have that information, for example, from California yet. So so we need to get people to start recording this information so that we can then have a more accurate picture of what's going on.
There's one last thing the lack of leadership in this country is, I mean, it's really shocking. It feels like, and this is just a feeling that I have, it feels like California is on its own, like New York is on its own, and that there's no there from the federal government, and that lack of leadership, that lack of access, that lack of power, and also on the world stage. I saw an interview with the Prime Minister on Fareed Zakaria on Sunday morning with the Prime Minister of Shanghai, is it not Shanghai? One of those city-states, Singapore. And this man was, oh my God, he was the clarity of his thought, his ability to communicate, his calmness. And he said the United States is just not present. It's just not present in the world, that this president has taken us out of the leadership role all over the world and has left a gigantic gap. And he said, well, what are we going to do about that? He said, well, someone else will come to the fore and we will work as the community of nations. And I think actually what's going to happen is that China is going to just place itself right into that soft power. It's already sending thousands of doctors and nurses and people to Italy and other places, and using its resources and its economic power to help. And the United States is just falling because of one man, and that thinking that.
Well, it's one man, but I think going back to something I said before, we have to remember why he's there.
Right.
And it's because of racism, and it's because of misogyny.
Right.
And we're paying a high price for our country's commitment to racism and misogyny.
Right.
And now we're seeing that it's killing people, and that there's blood. And we say it's blood, there's blood on Trump's hands. Yes, indeed. But again, we have to ask ourselves, how did he get there in the first place, and why is he there? racism and misogyny are killing us. And until we realize that we're paying a high price for living, for our commitment to these social injustices, then we can't be surprised at what we're seeing. We've been on for a while, so I need to probably move on to bed. But should we close with prayer?
We have a prayer that we said together at St. Columba that I inherited from this great community, and we always say it together. And so that's the prayer. But first of all, before we say that prayer, thank you, Brian. That's absolutely illuminating.
Thank you guys. It's wonderful. You guys are great. Thank you. It's been wonderful to be with you guys. It's been excellent.
And
Bravo.
the check is in the mail, Father. Don't hold your breath.
Yeah.
So let us all pray together. May the Lord watch between me and thee while we're absent one from another. Amen. God bless everybody.
Bless you, Brian.
Thank you.
Bless you guys. Thank you. Okay, take care. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Stay safe.
Hi,
Stay healthy.
sisters.
Okay.
And brothers.
Tell it, Father Chisholm. Hi, Father Quigley.
Oh, I
Hi.
will. I'll say Father Chisholm and Father Quigley. Hi. Take care.
From Oakland.
Oh, yeah, he's from Oakland. That's right. That's right.
Yeah, do a special hello from Greg to Greg from me. I haven't talked to him.
Yeah.
Sure, I'll be happy to. He'll be happy to hear from you, hear about you guys. Great.
God bless.
Good night,
Bye.
everybody. Bye.